The summer of 1886 burned across Kansas like a slow-moving wildfire, turning the fields brittle and the tempers shorter than a gambler's patience. Townsfolk walked with handkerchiefs pressed to their faces, boots kicking up dust that settled into every crease of a man's clothes and a young woman's soul. Lila Mae Carver was just 19, a slip of a girl with eyes the color of creek water in a drought and hair like cornsilk braided tight down her back. She stood barefoot in a cattle pen behind the Buck Hollow auction house, her sundress sweat-soaked and clinging to her frame. Her wrists bore the faint shadows of rope, marks from the journey that brought her here, traded hands from one dead-hardened uncle to a livestock handler who thought labor meant more than mules and less than men. Folks always said she was born unlucky. Her ma died birthing her in a clapboard shack on the Arkansas line, and her pa drank himself quiet by the time she was 8. Since then, she'd been passed around like a broken fiddle, never played right, never kept long. This morning, she'd been sold for the price of 2 barrels of molasses and a box of nails. The auctioneer had called her good with animals and not one to talk back. And that was enough for the man who stood just beyond the dust cloud, Stellan Ridge. He was a rancher, they said, came down from the Sand Hills country with sun-cracked hands and a face carved from years of wind and worry. Didn't smile much, didn't bargain either. He stepped up, paid in coin, then nodded once, just once, before leading Lila out by the arm like he'd bought himself another cow. But he didn't touch her wrong, didn't look at her with the kind of eyes that took more than they gave. He kept his distance, said nothing, till they reached the buckboard wagon hitched at the edge of town. "You got a name?" he asked, his voice low and even. "Lila Mae," she answered, her voice hoarse from silence and sun. "Carver." He looked out over the plain, where heat waves danced like ghosts above the dirt. Then he said, without looking at her, "Lila Ridge suits better. Folks'll talk less if you carry my name." She blinked, not sure she heard him right. "Don't mean nothing beyond safety," he added. "You sleep in the house. You eat at my table. But I won't touch what ain't offered. You're labor by law, but that ain't how I run things." Lila stared at him, dust swirling round her ankles like a whisper. He was a stranger, could have been a monster. Instead, he was giving her a name, a shield. They rode in silence for hours, the wagon creaking, and the wind slapping at the canvas. She held onto her bundle, 3 dresses, a Bible, and a lock of her ma's hair wrapped in linen. That was all she had. But by the time the sun dipped low and turned the hills gold, she also had a new name. By nightfall, he handed her a tin plate of beans and cornbread, set it on the table beside his own. "Lila Ridge," he said with a nod. "Eat." And she did. The Ridge place wasn't much to look at, a squat wooden cabin tucked between 2 cottonwoods and the dry lip of a creek bed. But to Lila, it might as well be been a palace. It was the first roof over her head that didn't come with cuffs or collars. That first night, she slept in a room with a bed softer than hay and a quilt stitched by hands steadier than hers. She lay awake long past the cricket serenade, listening to the soft creak of old wood and the distant snort of horses in the barn. Stellan Ridge rose before the sun, same as he had every morning for 20 years. By the time Lila rubbed the sleep from her eyes, he'd already saddled 2 horses, boiled coffee, and split enough firewood to last a week. "Breakfast's by the stove," he said without glancing at her. "If you're staying, you'll earn it." She didn't argue, just tied her hair back and set to work. The days blurred into each other like paint left in the rain. Mornings brought the hum of bees in the sunflowers and the rustle of wind through dry grass. Lila milked cows, gathered eggs, and learned the rhythm of the land. She watched Stellan from a distance. The way he moved like the wind didn't scare him none, even when the sky turned mean. He never asked questions, never pressed. But he left things for her, a second biscuit on the plate, a clean pair of gloves, a small silver comb she found one morning on the porch rail. And at night, when the heat still clung to the walls, they sat on opposite sides of the porch in silence. Not the awkward kind, no. It was the peaceful sort, like 2 folks respecting each other's ghosts. One evening, near the end of July, thunder rolled low across the plains. "Storm's coming," Stellan said, eyes on the horizon. The sky was swollen purple and split by lightning far off. Lila nodded. She knew storms, knew how fast they could twist from beauty to ruin. They worked together in a quiet frenzy, tacking shutters, tying down the stock shed, herding the animals close. Just before the clouds let loose, they ducked inside. Rain slammed the roof like Judgment Day, and wind howled like a woman scorned. Then came the crack, which split sharp and sudden. A tree down. Lila jumped. Her breath caught. Her hands shook like they used to when her uncle drank too much. Stellan noticed. He didn't speak, just reached into a drawer, pulled out a small tin, and set it before her. Inside were sugar cubes. "Storm don't last forever," he said gently. "This helps." She stared at that tin like it held gold. Then, with trembling fingers, she picked one up and let it melt slow on her tongue. The storm outside raged on, but inside the cabin, something else was changing. Quiet and slow, like the first green shoot after a long drought. She looked at him through the firelight, his profile lit in flickers, and wondered what kind of man gave a stranger his name and shelter without asking anything in return. And somewhere deep down, a question stirred. What if this place wasn't just a stop on the trail? What if it was the end of the road she'd been riding toward all along? The morning after the storm broke, the prairie smelled like wet cedar and old forgiveness. Lila stood barefoot on the porch, steam rising off her coffee cup as the world dried itself in the sun. The cottonwoods had lost a limb in the wind, splintered and sprawled like a giant's broken arm, but it missed the house by inches. "Lucky," Stella muttered, not quite looking at her as he passed with his axe. She almost smiled. Almost. Days turned brighter after that. The rhythm of work became muscle memory. Lila moved like she belonged, not just labored. Stellan still didn't speak much, but she caught him watching her once, when she brushed down the mare with a gentler hand than most men ever knew. He said nothing as usual, but later that day, he repaired her boot with a stitch so fine it near looked store-bought. But peace don't last long out on the frontier. One day, just past noon, the sound of hooves on dry ground snapped the stillness like a snake bite. Dust rose on the southern trail, and 2 riders crested the ridge. "Trouble?" Lila asked, wiping her hands on her apron. Stellan didn't answer, just squared his shoulders and walked slow to the hitching post. The men dismounted without invitation, one heavy-set with a mouth full of tobacco, the other younger, mean in the eyes. "Well now," the big one drawled, "ain't this a fine setup?" Stellan didn't flinch. "You lost." The younger man looked at Lila, and his smile twisted like barbed wire. "Nope. Just curious how a man like you can afford a housekeeper that pretty." Stellan's jaw set tight. "She's Ridge. Name's on the ledger." The men looked at each other. The older one spat in the dirt. "Ain't what I heard." That's when Lila knew. Her past, like a wolf with blood on its muzzle, had caught the scent. Word had traveled. Fast or slow, lies always did. "You work for Briggs?" Stellan asked, voice flat and low. The younger man stepped forward. "Briggs says she was indentured to him for 3 more months. Said she ran off, and you bought damaged goods." Lila's breath hitched, but she didn't move. Her heart pounded like hoofbeats on rock. "She's not property," Stellan said, "and Briggs knows better than to test me on it." "Well," the older man grinned, "maybe he's willing to call your bluff." Then his hand drifted toward his belt, but before the leather even creaked, Stellan's rifle was in his hands, smooth, fast, like it was born there. The barrel didn't shake. The look in his eyes said don't. Nobody spoke. Then the older man chuckled, raised his hands. "Ain't worth dying over, I suppose. We'll tell Briggs you send your regards." They rode off slow, dust rising behind them like smoke. Stellan stood still for a long while after, rifle lowered, but not yet put away. "You gonna ask?" Lila said, her voice soft. "About what?" "If I really ran." He looked at her, long and quiet. "No," he said, "ain't my place to ask. Ain't your burden to carry no more." Something in her chest cracked open, like a dry branch caught in spring wind. She didn't cry, just nodded and turned toward the house. But later that night, she sat beside the fire, a quilt draped over her knees, and told him anyway. told him about Briggs, the long days, the bruises hidden, the nights where her voice didn't belong to her. Stellan said nothing, just handed her the tin of sugar cubes and poured her coffee fresh. "You're not broken," he said finally, "just unclaimed by peace. But peace don't come to those who wait. Gotta be built, like a fence, or trust." Lila looked at him, and for the first time, believed it might be true. Summer deepened over the Kansas plain, the days stretching long as a preacher's sermon and just as dry. The sun baked the soil till it cracked underfoot, and the wind came only to stir dust and stir trouble. Lila had found her place among the rhythm of ranch life. Her hands toughened, her shoulders squared, and the memory of her old life softened like old rope left in the rain. She rose with the rooster, worked till the sweat clung to her like a second skin, and rested only when the last light bled from the sky. Stellan was the same, quiet, steady, full of hard-earned silence. But his eyes had softened. Not all the time, not enough for most to notice, but she did. He started showing her how to mend saddle leather, how to brace a post, how to patch the chicken coop when coyotes got bold. Always beside her, never behind or ahead. One afternoon, while set in new fence posts along the west pasture, Lila wiped her brow and leaned on her shovel. "You always work like the world's gonna end tomorrow?" she asked, breathing heavy. Stellan shrugged. "World don't owe us tomorrow." She chuckled, a small sound, dry as the air but real. "You always talk in riddles." "Only when I don't want to answer straight." He looked at her then, and there was a question in his eyes, one he didn't speak, but she saw it plain as day. "You can ask," she said, her voice low. "I don't want to ask nothing you ain't ready to tell." That was Stellan Ridge, always making room for silence, not just filling it. That night, after supper, the wind kicked up again, hot and restless, like it was looking for something. They sat on the porch, each with a tin cup of sweet coffee. Crickets chirped low, and the prairie lit up with lightning far off, but steady. "You ever been married?" Lila asked. Stellan didn't move for a moment. "No," he said. "Came close once." She got tired of waiting on a man too busy patching a roof to patch his heart. Lila turned that over in her mind. "You think that's all it takes? Waiting?" He met her gaze. "Reckon it takes two folks willing to carry the load when the other drops it." They were quiet again after that, until the fire burned down and the wind died out. But something hung in the air between them, soft, strange, and real. That night, sleep came slow. Lila lay under her quilt, listening to the house creak and settle. She thought of his hands, calloused, yes, but careful. Thought of the way he looked at her, not like a man starving for a woman, but like a man standing at the edge of a cliff wondering if it was worth jumping. And she thought about herself, not as labor, not as someone to be pitted or purchased, but as Lila Ridge. The name hadn't just been a shield. It had started to feel like a root, digging into soil she might someday call home. The week that followed was dry enough to blister a lizard's tongue. The creek shrank down to a muddy ribbon, and the horses kicked at the cracked earth like they were itching for rain. Lila worked through it all, hauling buckets, patching roofs, and set tin traps for a fox that had taken a shine to their chickens. But it wasn't just chores weighing heavy. It was the feeling that something was coming. On the fifth day it came. Late afternoon, just as the sun hung low like a gold coin about to drop, a wagon rolled up the ridge trail, a rickety thing drawn by a swayback mule and guided by a man Lila hadn't seen in nearly a year. Tommy Briggs. He was shorter than she remembered, but meaner in the eyes. Dressed better than he earned, with a silver-toothed grin that made your skin crawl. "Well, well," he called out, climbing down and dusting his coat. "Ain't you looking domestic?" Lila froze on the porch steps, her hands still damp from scrubbing. Stellan stepped out behind her, rifle resting casual in his arm, but his jaw was stone. "Don't recall envying you, Briggs." Briggs laughed. "Ain't here for you, Ridge. I'm here for what's mine." He turned his gaze to Lila. "Contract says she owes me till harvest. Ain't about feelings. It's business." Lila stepped down. Her voice didn't shake. That contract was bought out, Paid clean in Abilene by Stellan Ridge. You signed the ledger. Briggs spat. I signed nothing. And unless you got proof, that girl's running from debt, and I've got the papers to prove it. Stellan moved slow, like he was walking on glass. You bring law with you. Briggs hesitated. Didn't figure I'd need it. That's where you're wrong. And that's when it happened. Briggs reached for his pocket, fast and sloppy. Lila saw the glint of iron, heard the hammer click. But Stellan's rifle barked before Briggs even cleared leather. The bullet hit the ground inches from Briggs' boots. Not a kill shot, just a warning. Briggs froze. You pull steel on this land again, Stellan said, voice like a storm ready to break. And you won't get another warning. Briggs cursed low, eyes darting between them. You think this is over? I think you'd best ride before I stop shooting dirt. And Briggs did, cursing all the way down the trail. After the dust settled, Lila looked at Stellan. He'll come back. I know. You could have. I know that too. They stood there a long while, not speaking. The air smelled like gunpowder and sweat, and the sky above was painted in fire. Later that night, she found herself at his door, not out of fear, but out of need. I don't want to run no more, she whispered. He nodded. Then you won't. And that night, she slept easy, knowing that for the first time in her life, someone would stand between her and the dark. Not because he had to, because he chose to. The next morning broke hot and windless. Even the birds seemed too weary to sing, and the air hung heavy like the sky itself was holding its breath. Lila rose before dawn, same as always, but there was something different in her step, something sure-footed, like a woman who'd stopped waiting for permission to belong. Stellan was already out in the west pasture, mending the gate where a bull had leaned too hard. She walked out with a jug of water, her dress hitched above her boots, hair tucked up in a red kerchief. You missed breakfast, she said, off-airing the jug. He took it with a nod, wiped his brow with his sleeve. Didn't want to wake you. I ain't a house cat, she replied, smirking. That got the faintest smile out of him, and that was a win she'd take. They worked side by side most of the day, barely speaking, but their silences had grown comfortable, familiar, like two old trees sharing the same patch of dirt, their roots tangled where the eye couldn't see. By noon, the sky had gone dark as bruised peaches. Storm clouds rolled in from the west, fast and angry. Stellan stopped mid-stride, eyes on the horizon. We need to bring the herd in, he said, already moving. They worked fast, herd in, corral in, checking doors and shuttering windows. Sweat clung to them both, and when the first drops fell, they hit like thrown stones. By the time the worst of it roared in, the house was locked tight, lanterns lit, and thunder rattling the walls. Lila stood by the fire, wringing rain from her dress. Stellan brought him more wood, his shirt plastered to him like a second skin. He looked at her, really looked, and she saw it. That hunger he kept buried. Not lust. No, it was deeper. The kind that wanted to protect, to hold, to keep. She didn't look away. I ever tell you why I bought your name that day? He asked, voice low. She shook her head. I'd seen too many men treat women like tools. When I saw you, standing there, jaw set like you was carved out of grit, I knew you weren't anyone's labor. You were something else. Someone. The room fell quiet but for the fire and the thunder beyond. Lila stepped close. I don't need a savior, she said. I know, but I could use a partner. Stellan took a breath like he'd been holding it for years. You already are, he said. They didn't kiss. Not then. The moment was quieter than that. Just a hand brushed against hers, and the air between them shifted. Less storm, more promise. Outside, lightning split the sky. Inside, two people stood not as strangers, not as rancher and laborer, but as something new, something starting. The storm passed by morning, leaving the earth soaked and glistening like it had been baptized. The smell of wet sage and scorched wood hung in the air, and Lila stood on the porch, arms folded, staring down the trail like she knew what was coming. And she did. Briggs never was the sort to let things lie. He rode in just before noon with 3 men at his back, all of them looking, like they hadn't come for a visit. Dust on their coats, guns at their hips, and eyes cold as river stone. Stellan met Em at the gate, rifle slung but loaded. "Thought I told you to stay gone," he said. Briggs grinned, silver tooth flashing. "And I told you she's still under contract. Judge in Abilene confirmed it. Paperwork's coming. I just came to collect." Lila stepped off the porch before Stellan could speak. "She ain't yours," she said. Not her voice, not her stance herself. "You can wave your fancy paper," she went on. "But you and I both know it don't hold a drop of truth. You never paid me fair, never fed me right, and sure as in never treated me like a person. So I'm done being a name in your ledger." Briggs scowled. "This ain't how it works, girl. You don't just get to walk." Lila stepped closer. "I didn't walk. I rode, behind a man who gave me his name, so you couldn't take mine." That's when Stellan stepped beside her. Not in front, beside. "You want to test the law, you go to town," he told Briggs. "But you cross this gate again with threats and steel, well, I won't shoot the dirt this time." Briggs looked between the two of them, Lila standing tall, Stellan steady as bedrock. Then he spat, barked a curse, and turned his horse. They left in a trail of dust and failure. When the sound faded, Lila turned to Stellan. "Think that's the end of it?" "Maybe. Maybe not." She nodded, thoughtful. "Either way, I ain't going nowhere." He smiled then, just a little. "That makes two of us." That night, they sat together on the porch with a quilt between them, her head on his shoulder, his arm across her back. And though not a word passed between them, the silence said plenty. She was done running. He was done standing alone, and they were both ready to see what came next. August rolled in heavy, hanging thick with heat and the scent of ripening grain. The land, once brittle from drought, now rose green and golden beneath the sun, like it had forgiven every hardship ever laid upon it. Lila rose early, moving with purpose through each day, her steps no longer careful, but confident. She belonged here, and the land seemed to know it too. Together, she and Stellan mended fence lines, sowed fall beans, and even painted the barn, a faded red that caught fire in the late light. She laughed more now, and he did too, in his own quiet way, shoulders relaxed, eyes softer. The townsfolk had started noticing the change. Stellan was no longer just a silent rancher with old scars and a tight jaw. He was the man who came to market with a woman at his side who knew how to haggle, who left church socials early with a soft smile and a steady hand on his arm. And Lila, well, she wasn't just a girl from the auction no more. One afternoon, a package arrived, wrapped in twine and dust. Inside was a crisp paper, embossed and signed in ink. The contract. Briggs' claim, null and void. Turned out, he'd lied through half his teeth, and the court knew it. The judge's seal confirmed what Lila already knew in her bones. She was free, proper, and legal. She stared at the paper for a long time. Stellan said, "You want to burn it?" She shook her head. "No," she said. "I want to keep it." "Why?" "To remember where I started, so I never forget how far I've come." That night, the moon rose full and fat over the prairie, casting silver shadows across the porch where they sat with coffee and silence between them. Lila leaned into his side. "You ever think about making it official?" she asked, voice soft as wind through wheat. Stellan looked down at her, his thumb brushing the back of her hand. "You mean paperwork?" "No," she said. "I mean vows. Rings. Church bells, maybe." He was quiet a long moment. Then, "I'd stand in front of 100 folks, in my Sunday boots and clean shirt, and swear I'd love you, till the sun stopped rising." She smiled. "Then let's do that. No rush. No need to chase it. Just a promise, hanging there between them, strong as barbed wire and twice as true." The name Ridge had started as protection. Now it was hers. The wedding was set for the last Sunday of September, under the cottonwoods, where the creek used to run wide. The preacher from Dodge rode out special, and the townsfolk came in their best, some out of respect, some out of curiosity. Lila wore a simple dress, soft cream, not white, with lace sheets on herself. Her hair was braided with prairie grass and tied with blue ribbon. Stellan stood tall beside her, cleaned up proper in a crisp shirt and boots so polished they caught the sun. He held her hands like they were something precious. And when he said her name, Lila Ridge, it sounded like a prayer wrapped in promise. There weren't no music but birdsong, no choir but the wind. But when they kissed, the world went still. Afterward, folks gathered round the fire pit out back, where whiskey was poured and pies set out on planks of wood. There was Logan, dancing, and a few tears from the women who remembered Lila as that poor girl from the auction. No one called her that now, but trouble has a way of crashing even the finest party. Just as dusk settled over the hills, a rider came through the gate, thin, with a coat dusty from distance and eyes that didn't blink right. Not Briggs. Worse, his name was Emery Slay. Used to ride with Briggs, but meaner, slower with words, quicker with steel. Lila remembered him, remembered the boots that kicked, the voice that whispered threats through the wall of her bunkhouse. He dismounted slow, hand resting near his hip. "Didn't get my invite," he said, eyeing Lila. Stellan stood, calm but coiled. "This ain't your place." Slay's eyes flicked over the guests. "Briggs sent me with a gift." He tossed a paper onto the fire. Flames licked at the edge. Court claims, false and forged. "I was supposed to scare you," he added. "Bring her back if I could." Lila stepped forward. "You're too late," she said. "I ain't going nowhere but forward." Slay looked at her, then at Stellan, and for a moment, the world held its breath. But Slay backed down. He turned, climbed into his saddle, and rode out without another word. Folks watched him go, murmurs passing like wind through wheat. Stellan came up beside her. "You all right?" She nodded. "He don't know my fear. Not anymore." That night, after the guests were gone and the lanterns burned low, Lila stood barefoot in the grass, her hand in Stellan's. "You think they'll stop coming?" she asked. He looked out over the dark fields. "No, but we'll be ready when they do." She smiled. "Good," she said. "I married a man, not a wall. But I'm glad you're both." They kissed beneath the stars, quiet, steady, and when they went inside, the house didn't feel like shelter anymore. It felt like home. October came with cooler winds and the scent of dry leaves scattering across the fields. The land had softened under Lila's hands, garden rose neat, fences mended, the barn painted clean red. The Ridge homestead looked like a place that had been loved for generations, though it was love just starting to bloom. Stellan spent his mornings walking the line, checking the property, eyes always on the horizon, not from fear, but habit. He was a man built to protect what he cherished, and now he had something real to guard. Lila spent her afternoons writing in a little leather journal she kept in the cupboard. Just notes at first, weather, chores, a recipe or two. But slowly, it filled with pieces of her, memories, hopes, the kind of thoughts she never spoke aloud. One day, as the sun dipped low, Stellan came back from town with a wrapped bundle under his arm. He handed it to her without a word. Inside was a wooden sign. Burned into it, "The Ridge Place, EST 1886. Lila touched the letters like they were sacred. "I didn't ask for this," she whispered. "No," he said. "You earned it." They mounted it by the front gate the next morning, just as the first frost kissed the tips of the grass. Lila watched the sun rise through the letters of her new name and felt something settle inside her. Not like a stone, like a seed. That winter was mild, and the storms never came. Letters arrived from women she'd worked with, women still stuck in places where their names were owned. Lila wrote back to every one. "You're not labor," she penned. "You're land, meant to grow things, even if someone else tried to salt your soil." By spring, other women came, some with bruises, others with babies, all with that same look Lila once wore, the kind that said they'd survived, but didn't know what came next. The Ridge Place made room. Stellan built bunks in the old feed house. Lila shared her table, her garden, her quiet, and they came not for shelter, but for starting over. Years passed. The land greened and browned and greened again. Stellan's hair grayed. Lila's hands grew rougher, her voice stronger. They never left, never needed to. And long after the world moved on, folks still told the story of the girl who'd been sold for labor, but claimed a name by Nightfall. Not just borrowed it, built it. Because when the wind moved through those cottonwoods and rattled the sign at the gate, it didn't whisper, just Ridge. It whispered Lila. And that was enough.